Hello. So I read some books in the last 2 months. This is about 2 months of reading. And this December I actually did finish three of these books. I finished three of these books in December. It was actually a lot more reading this month than usual. So let's talk about these. The first one I'm going to talk about is the currency wars, the making of a global crisis, the making of the next global crisis, by James Rickards. I've talked about James Rickards quite a lot. I think he's a great author because he has very anti-mainstream ideas, but also has the kind of argument style and data that you would expect from a typical mainstream thinker. He is kind of considered a conspiracy theorist, but at the same time his conspiracy theories are rooted in data. I said this a lot about this guy. I'm going to read all of his books. This was I think the second or third one of his books I read. But this book is really, really good if you want to understand how currency wars, like basically countries using their currency to bludgeon one another, is going to harm your personal wealth, or basically cause inflation for you. He talks about a lot of the gold standard back in the day, like 1935, and the Bretton Woods institutions, and how that was great for stopping basically runaway currencies, where people would engage in deliberate devaluation of their currencies so that they could increase their exports. Because if your currency is devalued, then a foreign country has a greater purchasing power in your domestic economy, which means those local businesses can export more. It's a pretty simple concept. He talks a lot about that and how we do need to bring back a gold standard because what you have now is just the US standard, the US dollar. He had some really great ideas about how if China and Russia ever decide to collaborate, which I don't think is ever going to happen, but if they decide to collaborate to basically create a new currency where Russia would only accept this currency to be traded. No, so Russia would only accept oil trades in that currency, and China would only accept cheap commodity trades in this currency that they knew, like they both invented and are both using. And basically, as a result, people would have to actually use that currency, which would make their currency stronger. Right? The whole idea behind the US dollar or the oil dollar is that countries have to hold US dollars to engage in international trade, right? That's why the US dollar is so strong. He's saying they could counter that. That's what this book is going to argue. Another great thing about this is he actually does do some exploration of hyperinflation inside this book. And he points out that a lot of countries that do go through hyperinflation, the only people who are left are people who buy commodities like gold stocks or actual real estate or actual tools and tangible things. And I thought that this was an interesting insight because there are countries right now that I have stocks in that are going through hyperinflation, and their stocks are actually performing really, really well. They're actually performing so well that even though there's hyperinflation, the performance of the stock will outcompete the hyperinflation. So here's a great example. If you look at Nepal has really bad inflation, but the stocks in Nepal can jump up 400%, which is not the inflation rate. So if you can pick the right companies in hyperinflation, there's actually money to be made in stocks. That was an interesting insight I got from this book. Now, the next one is The Four by Scott Galloway. This book was actually great. I thought it was going to be bad. I was wrong. Scott Galloway is a terrific writer and terrific thinker. There's another book, another author actually, I'll go so far as to say, his name's Bradstone, something Bradstone. He wrote The Everything Store. He wrote another book on Amazon, and he wrote a book called The Upstarts. He's not a bad writer, okay? Bradstone's not a bad writer. I'd say he's a solid 3 stars out of 5. Galloway is a solid 4.7 stars out of 5. In part because he uses data. This is one of the biggest qualms with business books, is there's a lack of data. Galloway uses data all the time to provide insights, and he talks about the meat and potatoes of businesses, right? Whereas with Bradstone, he'll talk about, for example, that, I don't know, maybe Amazon bought some kind of company. Maybe they bought drugstore.com, okay? And that's it. He'll just say they bought drugstore.com. Galloway, on the other hand, would say they bought drugstore.com, and this is their strategy. Here's the data that's supporting their strategy. This is what they want to come in the future from buying drugstore.com. He'll actually go into the nitty-gritty of it, which is what I like inside business books. But anyways, this book goes over Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Apple. He has a lot to say about these companies. One of the things he says, for example, is that they're the biggest destroyer of jobs and that they don't create new jobs at an equal rate. There's a bit of like a common myth that new technology brings along new jobs, but it doesn't, at least not in these companies. These companies are actively destroying jobs without creating new jobs. He even quotes Bezos as saying he's for universal basic income, but he also says that Bezos should show some vision on this topic and not just say he's for universal basic income, but actually provide like a plan. Another thing he talked about was Apple's branding. I do agree that like Apple is like a luxury brand, and he goes into how Apple has used its branding to gain competitive advantage in the marketplace. He even shows the competitors to Amazon, the retail, the shrinking of retail market percentage, and how Amazon has gained like 2,000 something percent in retail. Even, I think this book was published in 2016, so I'd have to see if there's more up-to-date numbers. But I'd imagine it didn't jump down to like 100%. It's probably still around like 1,800% gaining retail market share, which, I mean, Amazon's stock recently crashed. So if you believe any of these numbers, then I would say it's going to go continuously up. You don't have to worry about that. Yeah, this is a great book. And I would say if you want a business book, this is a good book to go for. And if you want a book on these tech companies, this is also a good book to go for. I should review this book more in depth. Now, another book I read, wow, you cannot see this. The Politics of Experience and The Bird of Paradise. So, when I first got this book, I did not know that The Bird of Paradise is actually a separate book. And it's actually in the back. Basically, 97% of the book is The Politics of Experience. And The Politics of Experience is about conformity and how society wants us to conform and how conformity can restrain the individual and stop the individual from developing. The writing style is very like 1970s, 1960s, borderline communist writing, meaning that it's very abstract. It's just overly abstract, right? It's someone who kind of roots their identity in being an intellectual. And because they root their identity in being an intellectual, they can't write in simple English. They have to write in convoluted abstractions. It's still a good book. I still think it's worth reading. And I still think the ideas in here are interesting enough. It does talk about, for example, how the mental health classifications that we now use are kind of oppressive, and they kind of revoke people's sense of identity. So like the second you get a classification of schizophrenia, you're no longer a person, you're someone with schizophrenia. I do think that's right on the money, and even today in modern culture, a lot of people do replace their identity with their diagnosis, willingly in some cases, but he thinks it's, in many cases, a detriment, an aggressive thing that society does to people. He also talks about how there's kind of this social norms of going through high school, university, so on and so forth, and kind of adopting these cultural identities that are out there and waiting for us, rather than developing who we are. So we become accountants, we become, engineers, we become psychologists, we become doctors. We become identities that are already existing, rather than picking our own and following our own path and not really labeling ourselves or kind of pushing ourselves into these boxes. Basically, the book is going to go over like just different various ideas related to how society makes you want to conform and how it restricts the individual. I would say it's worth a read. It's very short, and it was fun. The reading style is a bit convoluted, but it's still readable. Now, the next one is Bertrand Russell's The Conquest of Happiness. I made an actual 30-minute review, like an in-depth review of this book. If you really want that, go watch that video. I don't want to talk too much about this. I will say, I do want to read all of Bertrand Russell. He has 82 books. If anybody knows which books I should be skipping, that would be great. I'm not going to read all 82. Because if you wrote 82 books, then they're not books that are worth reading. Because you probably just wrote something that was really quick. There are probably 30 books that are worth reading of Russell's. That's my intuition. We'll see. But anyways, The Conquest of Happiness basically talks about how people make themselves unhappy, what are the causes of unhappiness, and how you can be happy. One of the things that I thought was particularly true about this book is the focusing on the self, too much self-focus. Russell talked about how he was suicidal and didn't want to live life and was completely depressed. And then he started focusing on mathematics rather than his own life, and he suddenly became a lot more happier. He also talks about how in modern society we're hyper focused on being entertained, and that we can't tolerate boredom. That is also true. Boredom is a good thing. We should be bored. Yeah, that's like basically some of the ideas in here. It's like self-help, but also like more refined. You know, it's like a glass of wine. Whereas most self-help books, like I'm thinking of like Joy on Demand. Like Joy on Demand is like a juice box. Okay, it's like a washed down, unrefined, uncultured drink. This is like a glass of wine when it comes to self-help, because it's Russell giving his insights and his intakes, and he's not relying on all the generic studies about meditation and mindfulness. This is a good book, and it's also a fun read. If you want to know more about it, watch my review, because there's a lot in here. Now the next book is Shadow Play by Tim Marshall. I will say this was actually the first book out of that stack I showed you in the beginning of this video. This is the first book I read, and I read this book probably exactly 2 months ago. I do not remember everything in this book, especially because I didn't sleep well last night. I will not remember everything in this book, so I'm just going to try and, just work with me here. This book is about Yugoslavia, and he was in Yugoslavia when some of the ethnic tensions were rising, and when America decided to bomb Yugoslavia. A lot of the book focuses on the guy from Serbia, the president of the time that people didn't want. It also focuses a lot on foreign intervention inside Serbia. And I actually appreciate that it focuses on foreign intervention inside Serbia, because it does cover it quite neutrally. For example, he talked about, and this is really great, he talked about how there was a joint, like a military cooperation between the British, the Germans, and the Americans. And now, he said that at one point the British and the Germans were already there, and the Germans brought along this drone brigade, where you could basically film things. We're using drones. This was in 1999. And he said that the British were really upset when the Americans arrived, because what the Americans did is when they arrived, they didn't cooperate with the Germans or the British. They kind of seemed to be going along their own agenda. And they actually hijacked this German drone brigade and used it to take pictures of military infrastructure. And this was before there was any set plan to bomb Yugoslavia. Basically, his conclusion was that the Americans were already hell-bent on bombing Yugoslavia, and there was nothing that they could do to stop it. And that's why you'll see, like, if you go back and look at the actual headlines beforehand, it's quite alarming, because America almost in public was presenting this idea that they were open to diplomacy and not going through with the bombings. But they seem to have planned behind the scenes to have already gone through with the bombings. So I like that he actually covered that. There was also some other things about how both sides committed war crimes when it came to the Serbs and Bosniaks, I think. Yeah, it was really good covering some of this stuff. It wasn't too biased. At least I didn't get the impression that it was too biased. He also kind of highlights how Russia came back onto the map. I'd say this book does give you a good overview of when Russia got back into foreign policy, because they rushed to basically an airfield in I don't know if it was in Serbia. I think it was in Serbia. They rushed to an airfield in Serbia, I think, and occupied it before the Americans could. And that's considered in geopolitics basically when Russia began to engage in foreign policy again, because they were kind of dormant beforehand because of the collapse of the USSR. But anyways, good book. Tim Marshall is a great writer, and the next book is also going to be a Tim Marshall book. Okay, Power of Geography. To be honest, when I came across these Tim Marshall books, I saw them in the bookstore, and I thought they were like normie books that were like not going to be good, because the way they marketed it just seems, I don't know, I always had this impression. The same thing happened with this other book called The Education of an Idealist. It's a memoir by like someone who critiqued US foreign policy and worked for the UN and then became an advisor for Obama. I thought it was going to be something bad, just because, I don't know, I see them all the time in normie bookstores, like mainstream bookstores, right? Not like academic bookstores. The point being is that I was wrong. These books are good. They are introductory, but they're still good. There are conflicts that I didn't even know about, and things that, for example, this book informed one of my investment strategies for oil for Australia. Something like 70% of the refined petroleum for Australia comes from Japan. So obviously Japanese petroleum companies are probably going to do well. Anyways, this book, Powers of Geography, is a good book. I think it's his best book, actually. Age of Walls was another good book. The Prisoners of Geography was okay. It wasn't bad, it was okay. And Shadow Play was, I mean, I think that was one of his earlier books. This one is definitely his best book, though, and I hope he writes more. This book goes over modern conflicts. I mean, I think this is, I think it covers mostly the Middle East and Africa. It goes over Australia, Iran, the United Kingdom, Greece, Turkey. It does talk about the Sahel. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly. I've only read the English word. The Sahel, basically, there's a lot of conflict going on there, and he talked about how France has a lot of troops there. And there's a lot of debate, actually. I want to read into this more about whether France is there to actually keep stability, because if the countries in the Sahel actually start to collapse, or if France put out all of its troops and they start to collapse, then that could lead to a lot of migrants coming to Europe, especially France, right? And the waterway to France is not that large. And if that did happen, also the French uranium mines that are there, which does supply a lot of uranium to France, would also be in danger. So there's a lot of interesting conversations here about is this actually France looking into the well-being of Africa, or is it still colonial France protecting its own economic interest? And I thought about this more. I would have to do research, but I don't think there was ever any American businesses in the Middle East that were explicitly American businesses. There might have been businesses doing trade with America, but France has actual French companies in Africa mining the uranium. So that's interesting. I would say, yeah, this book is really good if you're looking for a geopolitics book. I would recommend this book, and as a starter, and his other books too. Yeah, Marshall's a great writer. So those are some of the last books I read over a couple of 2 months. I've debated about doing a reading goals for 2023 video. We'll see. If you guys actually want me to talk about that, I will, but I just feel like everyone's going to do it, and to be honest, any reading goal that I set is most likely I'm going to fail because I'm overly zealous. So, if you guys want me to talk about that, I can make one. Yeah, those are the last books I read. They were good. That being said, bye-bye.